Hey guys, tonight we wander into the wind-whipped North Atlantic, where icy waves smack against the ragged Greenland coast, and where, if you squint hard enough, you can almost make out the ghostly outlines of turf-roofed longhouses. You hear the creak of timber, smell the tang of seal fat burning in lamps, and for a moment you imagine life here was hardy but manageable. Then the reality check hits. You probably wouldn't survive a week in this frozen outpost, unless you happen to enjoy starvation, endless winters, and neighbors who judge your sheep herding skills. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is right now. I love seeing how scattered across the world this little sleepy crew is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with the Norse settlements in Greenland, founded around the late 10th century by Eric the Red. You picture yourself trudging across tundra, boots crunching frozen lichen, the sea behind you clogged with drifting icebergs. At its height, the eastern settlement boasted about 500 farms, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people total. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, and even shipped walrus ivory back to Europe. From the outside, it looked like a brave success story. But over time, the lights in those turf houses dimmed, the church bells stopped ringing, and the colony simply vanished. For centuries, historians argued over why. The mainstream explanation always circled around climate. You sense the cold creeping in as the so-called Little Ice Age begins around the 14th century, shortening growing seasons and freezing the fjords earlier each year. The Greenlanders had built their identity on farming, cows grazing in meadows, butter on the table, but as the climate shifted, hay became scarce. Archaeologists digging through old middens, the medieval trash heaps, found fewer cattle bones and more seal remains. They didn't adapt quickly enough to survive only on the sea, like the Inuit neighbors who thrived in the same landscape. But here's the quirky twist: some scholars now argue that it wasn't just the weather, it was stubbornness. Imagine your medieval HOA refusing to let you downsize from cattle to goats because it wasn't prestigious. The Norse settlers wanted to maintain European status symbols, even in Greenland. Butter was classy. Seal blubber was barbaric. They clung to church rituals, exported ivory to Europe, and sent tithes to the Pope long after their own food security crumbled. You can almost hear the complaints, but what will the folks back home think if we live like seal eaters? Historians still argue whether their fate was sealed more by climate, social rigidity, or even bad timing in global trade. Walrus ivory had been their economic lifeline, but as elephant ivory flowed from Africa and Asia, demand for walrus tusks sank. Imagine running the only blockbuster video right when Netflix showed up. Your business model just evaporates. Recent science sharpened the picture. Isotopic analysis of bones from late settlers shows malnutrition setting in. Bodies stressed from lack of variety in diet. Climate reconstructions from ice cores reveal harsher winters. And most fascinating, pollen records from lake sediments reveal overgrazing. Fields turned barren, soil blew away, and erosion left them desperate. It's a classic ecological cautionary tale: don't overwork your backyard if you actually want to eat from it. Still, not everything was doom. You wander through the ruins of Volsey Church, the best-preserved stone building in Greenland, where the last written record from the colony, a wedding in 1408, still haunts us. Guests danced in the hall, ate their feast, and likely whispered about how thin the cattle had grown. Then silence, the quirky tidbit. In some layers, archaeologists found imported luxury goods, fine cloth, fancy church relics, suggesting that right up until the bitter end, Greenlanders kept up appearances. They had imported wine goblets even while probably chewing on tough dried seal. It's like hosting a dinner party with paper plates but insisting on serving champagne. So, what happened at the very end? Some theories suggest a slow trickle of survivors sailed back to Iceland. Others propose they were wiped out by disease, pirates, or absorbed into Inuit communities. Still, the archaeological record points mostly toward starvation and abandonment. No sudden disaster, just families packing up and leaving, until the last embers in the turf houses smoldered out. As you picture yourself standing there, cold air burning your lungs, it's oddly comforting and sobering. 1,000 years later, the grassy ruins remain, sheep graze where Norse cattle once stood, and the unanswered questions hum in the silence. Greenland holds its secrets well, but science is finally catching up. Explaining not only how a colony was lost, but why people cling to familiar ways even when the world shifts beneath them. You shuffle now into the echoing halls of legend, where torches sputter against damp stone and whispers of hidden gold bounce off the vaulted ceilings. The Knights Templar, the warrior monks in white mantles marked with red crosses, march into your mind's eye, dragging behind them one of history's longest-running rumors, that they guarded a treasure so vast, so mystical, that when the order was dissolved in the early 14th century, the loot just disappeared. You imagine yourself wandering through Parisian vaults, listening for the clang of a chest lid, only to find dust and forgotten parchments. Disappointing, yes, but very medieval. The Templars rose in the 12th century, sworn to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land. Over time, they morphed into something stranger, half monk, half banker. You picture a knight in chainmail who, instead of swinging a sword, is handing out receipts. Their network of commanderies stretched from Jerusalem to London, and pilgrims could deposit money in one location and withdraw it in another. That sounds like the first ATM, except it came with chainmail-clad security guards and the looming threat of excommunication if you bounced a check. When Philip IV of France turned on the order in 1307, accusing them of heresy, devil worship, and financial crimes, it was partly because he owed them a mountain of debt. Easier to burn your creditors at the stake than to pay up. The king seized their property, hoping to snatch their rumored treasure. But here's the twist: inventories drawn up at the time don't list mountains of gold. Instead, what archaeologists and scholars have found are ledgers, land deeds, and detailed financial accounts. Imagine tearing through your uncle's attic, expecting pirate booty, and finding tax paperwork. The mainstream fact here is blunt: the Templar treasure was administrative. They were fabulously wealthy, yes, but in land, rents, and IOUs. Their real fortune was the system they created, one that eventually influenced modern banking. No glittering golden ark hidden under Rosslyn Chapel. Just accountants in chainmail. Still, the quirky tales swirl. Some chroniclers claimed wagons of treasure left Paris the night before the arrests, escorted by loyal knights who vanished into the dawn. Later legends tied the Templars to everything from the Holy Grail to the Shroud of Turin. You picture yourself tiptoeing through a medieval barn, prying open a crate, half expecting glowing relics. Only to sneeze on bundles of sheep hides. Historians still argue whether some valuables did slip away. It's plausible that portable wealth, coins, chalices, reliquaries, was spirited out before Philip's men pounced. After all, the order had outposts in Portugal and Scotland that weren't under French control. In Portugal, the Templars simply rebranded as the Order of Christ, continued operations, and quietly passed their assets into new hands. Not so much a vanishing act as a corporate merger. Modern archaeology adds another twist. Excavations of Templar sites across Europe reveal not glittering chambers but modest quarters, chapels, and storerooms filled with pottery shards. At one English site, ground-penetrating radar suggested hidden cellars, only to reveal grain storage. Treasure? Yes, if you're a mouse, and yet, the myth persists. Partly because the Templars themselves were secretive, and partly because we humans adore imagining buried treasure. Shows up in every adventure movie, every conspiracy theory. It's the medieval equivalent of Bigfoot, maybe real, maybe not, but irresistible to chase, the quirkier tidbit. In some surviving Templar commandery records, there are entries for things like 12 hens and a cart of garlic. Picture that as the mighty treasure, garlic cloves rattling in a sack. A culinary inheritance, not a cosmic one. You wander deeper into the imagined vaults, touching cold stone walls, trying to will treasure chests into existence. But the true riches turn out to be parchment, boring, fragile, invaluable. Ledgers that show how land was leased, how debts were collected, and how the order maintained its sprawling empire. So in the end, the mystery isn't whether the treasure existed. It did, it just wasn't what romantic tales promised. And that may be the bigger lesson: medieval wealth wasn't piles of doubloons but boring paperwork. Yet paperwork, in its own way, shaped empires. The Templars' treasure still haunts us not because of what it was, but because we wish it had been something shinier. You step now into a Europe rattled by bells tolling for the dead, where carts creak under piles of bodies and priests mutter prayers through cloth masks that look suspiciously like oversized bird beaks. The Black Death, the pandemic of the mid-14th century that killed perhaps a third to half of Europe's population, has always been wrapped in mystery. For centuries, people whispered about poisoned wells, bad air, or divine punishment. You picture yourself clutching a sprig of rosemary, convinced it will save you, while eyeing your neighbor suspiciously. Spoiler, it won't. The mainstream fact is clearer now than it ever was. Scientists have traced the plague back to Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that infested black rats. Trade ships sailing from the Crimea in 1347 ferried both cargo and parasites, delivering the plague into Mediterranean ports. From there, it spread like wildfire. Archaeologists and geneticists, working together, have confirmed the bacterium's genetic fingerprint in mass graves across Europe. No wrath of the gods, just infected fleas doing their grim work. But here's the quirky twist: not all historians are convinced it was only the classic rat-flea cycle. Some argue that human fleas and lice also played a role, hopping from tunic to tunic in crowded medieval streets. Others note that plague sometimes spread faster than rat populations could account for, hinting at airborne transmission in some outbreaks. Historians still argue whether the Black Death we picture is exactly the same disease as modern bubonic plague, or whether multiple pathogens piggybacked in those grim years. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval street, wooden shutters closed tight, a line of chalk crosses marking the houses where entire families lie silent. Then, oddly enough, a fiddler bursts into a song, because life, however tragic, keeps stumbling on. The sensory clash is unnerving, the stench of lime poured over corpses, mixed with the scent of baking bread from an open oven. The reality check is harsh. You probably wouldn't survive this world. Average life expectancy plummeted, priests dropped in droves, and entire villages vanished. One quirky tidbit: some towns tried bizarre prevention methods. In Siena, they burned juniper wood to purify the air. In London, they slaughtered cats and dogs, thinking they spread the disease, which ironically just let the rat population explode. Medieval science, 0, rodents, 1, and yet, out of the darkness, clues keep surfacing. In recent years, DNA extracted from teeth in plague pits across London, Barcelona, and elsewhere has confirmed Yersinia pestis beyond doubt. Even more, scientists traced its genetic evolution, showing that the same bacterium still causes occasional outbreaks today, in Madagascar, for instance. The medieval killer was no myth, it still lurks, just heavily controlled by antibiotics now. But what about the social mystery? Why did it spread so unevenly? Some regions suffered catastrophic losses, while others, Poland, for example, reported much lower death rates. Was it due to quarantine measures, geography, or luck? Historians still debate. Perhaps Poland's relative isolation, or simply underreporting, gave the illusion of safety. It's one of those medieval footnotes that keep scholars scratching their heads. And then there are the more fringe theories: cometary dust poisoning the air, or secret cults spreading toxins. Chroniclers wrote of pestilential mists rolling in before outbreaks. Modern explanations reduce this to coincidence, but you can't help but imagine the eerie sight: fog creeping into a valley, villagers crossing themselves, certain that death itself was descending. One of the strangest side effects was the flagellant movement, men marching barefoot through towns, whipping themselves bloody to atone for sin. You hear the slap of leather on flesh, the chants rising, a mix of fear and devotion. Today, scholars view it as both desperate faith and dangerous contagion, since crowds only spread the disease further. The quirky detail that lingers. Rats, the supposed villains of the piece, may not have been as central as once thought. Some studies suggest plague could spread without large rat populations at all, relying instead on human lice. So the mental image of rat armies fleeing burning ships may be more cinematic than real. Still, whether by flea or by louse, the outcome was the same. You stand on a medieval street, the silence broken only by the roll of a death cart. It's haunting, sobering, and yet somehow grounding. One of history's greatest mysteries has been peeled back, revealing not curses but microbes. And in that revelation, a reminder: you and I are fragile, but also endlessly curious. Still unraveling the threads of a nightmare 7 centuries later. You sway now into one of history's most bizarre spectacles: crowds of medieval townsfolk suddenly breaking into uncontrollable dance. Picture yourself in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The cobblestones are hot underfoot, the Rhine glints nearby, and without warning you start tapping your toes. Then your legs take over, flailing, spinning, and refusing to stop. Soon, dozens of your neighbors are jerking and twirling too, sweat dripping, hearts pounding. The scene looks like a rave without music, or maybe a TikTok trend that forgot to end. People danced for hours, days, sometimes collapsing in exhaustion. The mainstream explanation is clearer today than it ever was: some outbreaks of so-called dancing plague were probably caused by ergot fungus, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on damp rye. You imagine biting into a slice of dark bread laced with ergot, your vision shimmering, your body buzzing with spasms. It's basically medieval LSD, except no chill music and no one to remind you to hydrate. Scientists studying records of 1518 and earlier cases in the Rhineland believe ergot poisoning could explain the twitching and hallucinations, but there's a quirky twist: ergot alone may not explain why entire crowds joined in. Historians still argue whether mass hysteria, now called mass psychogenic illness, played the bigger role. The stress was real: famine, disease, and religious anxiety primed people for outbreaks of collective frenzy. Imagine living with crop failures, plague rumors, and sermons warning of divine wrath, then one woman starts dancing in the street. Instead of calling a doctor, you assume it's contagious, and suddenly your own legs feel itchy to move. The authorities, bless their medieval hearts, often made things worse. In Strasbourg, city leaders tried to cure the epidemic by building a stage and hiring musicians, thinking the dancers would sweat out the madness. It worked about as well as telling someone with hiccups to drink more soda. People kept collapsing, some reportedly dying of heart attacks or strokes mid-dance. Picture the sensory overload: drum beats echoing, sandals slapping stone, a chorus of gasps and cries as bodies fall, then stagger upright to dance again. You feel the rhythm pounding, relentless, until even the spectators sway in sympathy. There's something strangely hypnotic about it, even knowing it's deadly. Quirky detail. Some records say priests escorted dancers to shrines of saints, believing spiritual intervention was the answer. In one case, victims were led to the shrine of Saint Vitus, whose name became linked forever with Saint Vitus's dance. Imagine the awkward procession: exhausted, twitching people stumbling into a church while monks chant over them. It's a medieval mashup of medicine, faith, and performance art. Modern historians combing through parish notes and civic records have confirmed that these outbreaks were real, not just fables. They weren't joyful carnivals but frightening, involuntary episodes. Some lasted weeks, disrupting entire cities. What still remains debated is whether ergot hysteria, or both drove the phenomenon. It's unsettling to realize that human bodies, under stress, can behave in sync in such strange ways. Even today, mass psychogenic illnesses occur, students fainting in classrooms, factory workers collapsing in clusters, all triggered by shared stress. The medieval dancing plagues weren't so alien after all. As you stand in that Strasbourg square, sweat dripping down your back, you sense the exhaustion of bodies refusing to obey, the fear that you'll never stop moving. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the outbreak fades. Life returns to its uneasy rhythm. The mystery lingers, but science has drawn back the curtain. It wasn't magic, just mold and minds under pressure. Still, the image of a city trapped in a deadly dance remains one of the strangest, sleepiest stories the Middle Ages ever offered. You drift now into the cool shadows of a Gothic cathedral, the air heavy with candle smoke and centuries of whispered prayers. You run your fingers along the stone walls, rough and cold, only to find, scratched faintly into the surface, lines and shapes. At first they look like childish doodles, stick figures, spirals, crude ships. But look closer. What you're tracing is medieval graffiti, hidden for centuries, carved by hands both reverent and desperate. The mainstream fact is simple: many great cathedrals and churches across Europe are covered with graffiti. Not the spray paint kind, though admit it, you'd pay to see a monk tagging YOLO on a choir stall, but etched images left behind by medieval visitors. For a long time, these scratches were dismissed as vandalism. But recent laser scans and careful cataloging revealed they carried meaning: prayers, charms, even secret codes of protection. One quirky example: sailors carved little ships into church walls before voyages, believing the symbol would safeguard them at sea. Picture yourself crouching in a pew, nervously etching a tiny galley into the plaster, whispering a prayer for calm waters. Your ship may sink, but at least you left a backup plan on sacred stone. Historians still argue whether these carvings were official forms of devotion or borderline superstition. Some seem like ordinary folk sneaking in their private rituals, away from the stern eyes of clergy. Others may have been tolerated, even encouraged, as folk piety. Either way, the graffiti transforms the cathedral from a lofty monument into a communal diary, scratched layer by layer across centuries. You wander past the nave, noticing more protective circles called witch marks, drawn to ward off evil spirits. Spirals meant to confuse demons. Even crude outlines of hands, pressed against stone and traced like medieval signatures. Imagine the thousands of palms that once rested there, leaving ghostly echoes. The quirky tidbit: some graffiti includes game boards scratched into cloister benches. Monks, it seems, occasionally passed the hours with impromptu rounds of 9 men's Morris. So much for solemn contemplation. Turns out monks had coffee break energy too. Modern technology adds depth to the mystery. Archaeologists, using raking light photography, angles that highlight shallow scratches, have uncovered countless previously invisible carvings. In Norwich Cathedral alone, thousands have been documented. They reveal not just idle doodling but a catalogue of medieval hopes and fears, charms against plague, prayers for safe childbirth, and even rough portraits of saints. One carving shows a knight in armor, sword raised. Was it a child's dream? A pilgrim's memory? Or a prayer for protection before battle? We'll never know for sure, but the line between art and supplication blurs in every stroke. Historians debate how much of this was tolerated. Official church art was carefully commissioned, painted by skilled craftsmen. But these graffiti, done in secret corners or high up near roof beams, were unofficial voices of the ordinary faithful. Like comments scribbled in the margins of a holy book, they tell us what people really worried about. As you step back, you realize the great cathedrals weren't silent stone fortresses. They hummed with human fingerprints, literally. And even though priests preached sermons about proper worship, the walls kept the secret confessions of those who came through. The sensory detail lingers: the scrape of a small blade on stone, the echo of footsteps in a vast nave, the faint smell of wax and damp mortar. You close your eyes and imagine someone leaning in centuries ago, muttering a prayer as they carve. It's intimate, haunting, and surprisingly relatable. Today, these graffiti are finally recognized as treasures in themselves, not vandalism, but windows into everyday medieval spirituality. You might not find gold hidden in the cathedral vaults, but you'll find thousands of scratched prayers still clinging to the walls, whispering across time. You shuffle onward into the countryside of Suffolk, England, where the fields ripple with green grain and hedgerows hum with bees. Here lies Woolpit, a village that has held on to one of the strangest medieval tales, the appearance of two green-skinned children in the 12th century. You picture yourself trudging through the fields, and suddenly spotting two kids stumbling out of a wolf pit, hence the name Woolpit, clad in odd clothes, speaking a language no one could understand, and tinted with a peculiar green hue. Medieval X-Files, minus the trench coats. The mainstream fact is that chroniclers like William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall recorded the story, though with slight variations. The children reportedly refused to eat normal food at first, surviving only on beans. Eventually, they learned English, their green color faded, and the boy died young while the girl grew up, married, and lived a fairly normal life. Modern historians treat the tale as folklore, but one rooted in kernels of truth, the quirky twist. Science has recently nudged the mystery toward resolution. Scholars now suggest the green tint might have been chlorosis, what used to be called the green sickness, a form of iron deficiency anemia. Malnourished children often develop a sallow, greenish pallor. Imagine those kids, starving, stumbling into Woolpit with nothing but beans to cling to, while the villagers stared like they'd just met aliens. Historians still argue whether the children were refugees from a nearby Flemish community. At the time, many Flemish settlers lived in East Anglia, but conflicts and famine often left communities displaced. If the kids were orphans wandering from a half-ruined Flemish village, their strange clothes and language would have sounded foreign to locals. To the villagers, it may have been easier to cast the encounter as something supernatural. You pause by the village churchyard, feeling the cool stone of its walls, and imagine the girl recounting her story years later, how she and her brother stumbled into strange people, how they couldn't explain where they came from. Chroniclers recorded her words as if she described a land of twilight where the sun never shone. Was it poetic exaggeration? A confused retelling of a dense forest homeland? Or simply the way children process trauma, the quirky detail that sticks? The kids reportedly first recognized beans in their pods, pointing excitedly and eating them raw, as if they had lived entirely on that crop before. It's such a humble image, hungry children thrilled to find familiar food. Not exactly the behavior of extraterrestrials. Unless aliens just really love legumes, modern DNA evidence can't help much here. No remains of the children are known, but historical sleuthing makes the refugee theory compelling. Recent historians highlight how famine in the mid-12th century ravaged parts of East Anglia. Displaced children could easily have wandered miles, disoriented, until they collapsed near Woolpit, and yet, the myth lingers because the imagery is irresistible, green-skinned children emerging from the earth itself. Even today, the village sign bears two small figures shaded green, a reminder that folklore has longer legs than science, as you stand in Woolpit's fields. The breeze soft on your face, you can almost hear the villagers murmuring, torn between fear and pity. You imagine the girl's green fading with time, her story retold at firesides, then set down by monks who couldn't resist adding a mystical glow. The mystery is solved, mostly, but like all good medieval tales, it keeps a shimmer of wonder alive. You move now into a hushed medieval library, its shelves lined with chained tomes, the air thick with dust and candle smoke. You imagine yourself running your hand across vellum pages, only to find a blank gap where a work should be. The Middle Ages were full of missing books, volumes that once shaped minds but then vanished into wars, fires, or simple neglect. Some were rediscovered centuries later, like long-lost puzzle pieces, while others remained shadows on scholars' lists, the mainstream fact is that countless works of classical antiquity were known to medieval scholars only by reputation. Aristotle, for example, wrote hundreds of treatises, but only about a third survive today. The rest, poetics, natural histories, maybe even a comedy manual, simply disappeared. Imagine yourself sighing over a catalogue that promises Aristotle's Guide to Jokes, only to find it gone forever. Some of these texts, however, trickled back into Europe through Arabic translations preserved in Islamic libraries, especially in Spain, the quirky twist. Sometimes rediscoveries happen in the oddest ways. In the 19th century, a monk scraped off parchment to reuse it for prayers, a palimpsest. Centuries later, scientists with multispectral imaging uncovered the faint undertext, lost works of Archimedes, including a treatise on infinity. You picture yourself squinting by candlelight, trying to decipher smudged ink, only to realize its math so advanced it could still fry your brain. Historians still argue whether the Middle Ages lost knowledge due to ignorance or whether much of it was deliberately suppressed as heretical. The truth lies somewhere in between. War, fire, and the sheer cost of copying books meant many simply didn't make the cut. A medieval scribe might choose to copy a saint's life over an old Greek physics manual. And who can blame him? Physics doesn't exactly fill the collection plate. You shuffle toward another shelf, and here lies the quirky tidbit: some lost books aren't truly lost, just hiding. In monasteries across Europe, fragments of ancient texts have been found reused as binding for later books. Picture opening a 15th century hymnal and realizing the cover is patched together from shredded Cicero. Recycling, medieval style, even when texts survived, they often did so in translation. A Greek original might be lost, but a Latin or Arabic version preserved the gist. That's how Europe rediscovered Aristotle's natural philosophy, through scholars in Córdoba and Toledo, who translated Arabic commentaries back into Latin. You imagine the chain of hands, Greek to Arabic to Latin to modern print. Like a game of historical telephone, each copy smudged but still carrying the core ideas. One fascinating example is the recovery of Galen's medical writings. For centuries, doctors relied on only fragments of his work. Then, caches of Greek manuscripts surfaced in Renaissance Italy, expanding his influence all over again. It's as if the Middle Ages had a patchwork education, constantly filled in by surprise deliveries. But there are still mysteries, references to lost plays of Sophocles, or entire volumes of Tacitus's history that just never reappeared. Did they rot in damp chests? Were they eaten by mice? Or are they still waiting in some dusty monastery cupboard, undiscovered? Scholars keep hope alive, and every so often, a fragment does turn up, sometimes in the most boring-looking manuscript you could imagine. The sensory image lingers, candlelight flickering on chained volumes, the faint scratch of a quill, the hush of monks copying page after page. You feel the weight of absence almost as strongly as the presence of books themselves. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was fragile, always on the brink of vanishing. So when we speak of medieval mysteries solved, these rediscovered works remind us that solutions often arrive in fragments, ink smears under prayers, scraps reused as book covers, and whispers carried across languages. The Middle Ages may have misplaced entire libraries, but modern science keeps coaxing their voices back, page by ghostly page. You drift now into the cold, damp stones of the Tower of London, that fortress of fear where the fate of two young princes became one of the most haunting mysteries of medieval England. You imagine yourself standing in the shadow of its walls, listening to the echo of whispered rumors. What happened to Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York? The official story always danced around the truth, yet archaeology has tried to catch the shadows. The mainstream history is simple enough. In 1483, after the death of King Edward IV, his 12-year-old son Edward was supposed to inherit the throne. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named protector. The boys were lodged in the Tower of London. Then not just a prison but a royal residence, supposedly for safety before Edward's coronation. And then they vanished. Richard crowned himself Richard III, and the princes were never seen again. For centuries, the assumption was dark: the boys were murdered, perhaps on Richard's orders. Shakespeare certainly thought so, immortalizing Richard as the villainous hunchback who smothered his nephews in their sleep. But historians have debated endlessly. Was Richard guilty, or was it Henry VII, the usurper who came after him, who had the most to gain? The quirky twist comes in 1674, when workers renovating part of the tower dug up a wooden chest containing two small skeletons. Charles II ordered them buried in Westminster Abbey as the prince's remains. Mystery solved? Not quite. Forensic science didn't exist in the 17th century, and the bones were never conclusively identified. Modern investigations have tried. In 1933, the bones were re-examined, revealing they were indeed of children around the right ages. But the tests were crude, little more than measuring skulls and teeth. Calls for DNA testing have echoed for decades, but the Church of England has been reluctant to allow disturbing the royal tombs again. Meanwhile, historians note oddities. Richard III reigned for 2 years, yet faced little direct backlash for the boys' disappearance. Could it be they had already died of illness? Or that he kept them hidden, only for later events to seal their fate? Henry VII, after all, had every reason to erase rival claimants once he seized the throne. The prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, eventually reconciled with Richard, hardly the behavior of a mother who believed her sons had been murdered by him. The quirky tidbit here is that bones keep turning up. In the Tower precincts, skeletons of children have been found more than once, sparking wild speculation. Not all were royal, of course. Medieval London was crowded, and the Tower grounds have a long, bloody history. But every discovery rekindles the question: which bones are the prince's, if any? Forensic science keeps inching closer. In 2012, the dramatic discovery of Richard III's skeleton beneath a Leicester car park showed how DNA can rewrite history. That find reignited hopes. If Richard's DNA could be traced, surely so could the prince's. Yet the abbey resists, saying the sanctity of the tomb must remain. So the bones lie undisturbed, mysteries in stone coffins, while speculation fills the silence. You picture yourself walking through the tower by moonlight, ravens on the walls, the chill of the Thames, the sense that history here is never at rest. Somewhere beneath your feet may still lie the truth. 2 boys, buried hurriedly, their small skeletons telling a story of power, ambition, and silence. Was it Richard, desperate to secure his crown? Was it Henry, determined to erase Yorkist heirs? Or were the princes never murdered at all, but spirited away, their story swallowed by time? The weight of uncertainty lingers. In the great ledger of medieval mysteries, the princes in the tower remain one of the darkest, and even with science pushing at the edges, the riddle still refuses a final answer. You blink, and now you're hunched over a manuscript so strange that it feels like it's mocking you. Pages and pages of parchment filled with neat, looping handwriting in a language no one has ever been able to read, decorated with illustrations of plants that don't exist, women bathing in green pools, and bizarre astronomical diagrams. This is the famous Voynich manuscript, the ultimate medieval riddle, and as you squint at its scribbles, you can almost hear a medieval scribe chuckling in the background, whispering, "Good luck with that." The mainstream history is that this manuscript surfaced in 1912 when an antiquarian named Wilfrid Voynich bought it from a Jesuit library in Italy. He thought he'd stumbled upon a secret work by Roger Bacon, the 13th century English scholar. But historians now know it's a 15th century manuscript, radiocarbon dated to around the early 1400s. So, squarely medieval, its strangeness lies in its text. Written in an unknown script, nicknamed Voynichese, it flows smoothly, as if it were a real language. Yet no one has cracked it. Cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, even codebreakers from World War II all tried. Each time they thought they were close, the manuscript simply laughed in their faces. Some argue it's nonsense, an elaborate hoax designed to fleece a rich nobleman. Others argue it's a lost language, encoded with rules no one alive remembers. Historians still argue whether it's meaningful text or the world's longest prank. The quirky part is the artwork. On one page, naked women stand in tubs connected by tubes like plumbing schematics, as if someone was explaining an early water park. On another, strange zodiac wheels mix familiar symbols with unknown stars. The plants? They're hybrids, partly identifiable roots or leaves, partly fantasy fronds and blossoms. Scholars of herbal medicine puzzle over these. Were they attempts at medicinal drawings, or was the illustrator just really bad at botany? In recent years, technology has joined the chase. Machine learning algorithms have analyzed the text, noting patterns that look like natural languages. Some suggest it's related to Romance languages, perhaps enciphered Latin or a medieval dialect. A Canadian team once proposed it was shorthand for Hebrew, while another group claimed it's a women's health manual, full of herbal remedies and bathing instructions for fertility. If true, that would explain all the naked women. But none of these theories stick for long. Every solution quickly crumbles under scrutiny. The open scholarly debate is what keeps this manuscript alive in the public imagination. Is it a hoax? If so, it's an astonishingly consistent one, nearly 240 pages. Written with a linguistic structure so complex that it fools even computers. Hoaxes usually reveal themselves in sloppy repetition, but Voynich's doesn't. That suggests intent. Yet intent toward what? Medicine? Alchemy? Astrology? The world may never know, and then there's the fringe fun. Some insist it's an alien language, evidence of medieval contact with extraterrestrials. Others say it's the work of a lone genius, a savant creating a private code to guard personal knowledge. One of the funniest tidbits is that some historians speculate it might have been a medieval doodle book, where the creator never intended anyone else to understand. Imagine some monk hunched in a cell, bored out of his mind, inventing an entire alphabet just to pass the time. That's one way to survive without Netflix. You picture yourself turning a page by candlelight. The vellum feels smooth beneath your fingers, but the drawings don't get less baffling. Are you looking at medical recipes? A coded grimoire of spells? A cosmic joke? Each strange glyph pulls you deeper, and instead of clarity, the mystery only thickens. The most recent consensus edges toward the idea that the Voynich is indeed a practical text, probably medical or herbal, written in some form of cipher. But until someone cracks it, it sits in Yale's Beinecke Library, taunting scholars and delighting conspiracy theorists alike. Even modern decoding software, with all its power, hasn't pried it open, so you sigh, close the book, and realize that in the long night of medieval puzzles, the Voynich is the one that whispers, "Sleep on it." But don't expect to wake with answers. You trudge now into the frozen landscapes of late medieval Europe, the wind biting through your cloak as you survey fields, forests, and villages blanketed in snow. This is the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long chill that arrived around the 14th century and lingered until the 19th. Crops failed, rivers froze earlier than usual, and peasants trudged through mud and frost that seemed determined to eat their lives. The climate wasn't just unpleasant, it reshaped societies. The mainstream fact is that tree-ring analysis, ice cores, and sediment layers all confirmed the drop in temperature. Winters lengthened, growing seasons shrank, and the Thames froze over for months at a time, prompting the famous frost fairs in London. You can almost feel the frost biting your fingers, the river solid under your feet, carts creaking across ice that shouldn't safely hold them. But here's the quirky twist: cold weather didn't just make life miserable, it inspired creativity and weird markets. Frost fairs sold ice sculptures, hot pastries, and, apparently, winter miracles in the form of small mechanical toys. People adapted in strange ways. You picture a merchant on the frozen Thames, juggling candied apples and ice blocks, shouting over the wind while hoping you don't fall through the river. Medieval ingenuity is sometimes more amusing than practical. Historians still argue whether the Little Ice Age was triggered by volcanic eruptions, solar activity, or a combination of both. Some point to the massive eruption of Somalas in 1257, which ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that Europe saw crop failures decades later. Others suggest sunspot cycles played a role. Whatever the cause, the effects were widespread: famine, social unrest, and the decline or disappearance of some villages. You can almost see abandoned homesteads, roofless and snow-dusted, where livestock wandered in confused solitude. The human response was fascinating. People tried everything: ice fishing festivals to make frozen rivers profitable, heated baths as luxuries for the wealthy, and odd urban innovations like wooden walkways through muddy streets. The poor, of course, suffered most. They ate less, burned dung for warmth, and prayed the frost would pass. One record mentions a town where villagers resorted to eating bark and moss. Imagine chewing on pine bark and telling yourself it counts as a meal. Here's a quirky tidbit: in Iceland, the cooling climate led to the demise of some Norse settlements that had survived centuries before. Archaeologists now know that people struggled to raise hay for cattle, forcing reliance on fish and other limited resources. You might remember Greenland's vanished Norse colony. This is history repeating itself on another scale. Even politics was shaped by the cold. Crop shortages fueled rebellions and tension between landlords and peasants. In France, harsh winters contributed to unrest that simmered into the Jacquerie uprising. In England, frost-damaged grain stores helped trigger food riots. You can almost hear the shouting in the square, the cracking of frozen cartwheels, the despair turning into defiance. The scientific side of the story deepens the picture. Ice cores show layers of soot, ash, and pollen, revealing the environmental stresses people faced. Pollen analysis confirms widespread deforestation and soil erosion as communities tried to squeeze every scrap of nutrition from their land. Livelihoods were fragile, survival precarious, and one bad season could topple centuries of stability. In short, the Little Ice Age was not just cold, it was disruptive, weirdly creative, and profoundly human. You picture yourself huddled by a hearth, snow pelting outside, villagers telling tales of frozen rivers and frost fairs, children slipping on ice, and adults muttering prayers for warmth. And yet, in that bitter cold, communities adapted, stories persisted, and life trudged stubbornly forward, teaching resilience in ways subtle, harsh, and unforgettable. You wander now into the winding, narrow streets of medieval Venice, where canals glimmer under a low sun, their dark surfaces flecked with molten gold. Gondolas creak over water so still and yet so ominously alive that each ripple seems to conceal a secret. The city hums with the activity of merchants, sailors, and artisans, voices bargaining in a dozen tongues, footsteps echoing against stone bridges, and bells tolling faintly from distant churches. Yet behind this facade of bustling commerce, a darker rhythm persists: the whispered tales of peculiar crimes, most infamously the mysteries of the so-called devil's ships. These were no ordinary maritime accidents but sudden fires, vanishings, or unexplained wrecks in the lagoon, events often blamed on curses, witchcraft, or some malevolent hand unseen. You imagine yourself moving cautiously along the slippery cobblestones, the mossy stones slick beneath your boots, peering into the shadow-drenched water that licks at the edges of the canal walls. Every boat that passes feels suspect, every gondola's polished hull hiding potential doom. Which vessel, you wonder, might be next to vanish into smoke, flame, or silence? The historical truth is stark enough. Venice thrived as a maritime republic from the 12th through the 15th centuries, commanding the channels of trade between Europe and the East. Its ships carried spices that perfumed entire warehouses, silks that shimmered like water in moonlight, and precious metals that could tilt the balance of kingdoms. Wealth poured into the city, building palaces and funding cathedrals, but with wealth came vulnerability. Wooden ships, laden with oil, pitch, and volatile goods, were tinderboxes on the waves. Fire aboard such a vessel meant catastrophe. And sudden disappearances at sea or in the lagoon were not just frightening, they threatened the very lifeblood of the Republic. Some were accidents, doubtless. Yet others, shrouded in whispers and rumor, grew into enduring legends. Here comes the twist whispered by scholars. Some historians now suggest that the dreaded devil's ships may not have been the work of demons at all but deliberate sabotage carried out by rival merchants, feuding families, or even political factions. The labyrinth of canals was the perfect arena for covert warfare. Imagine the quiet stealth of scuttling a competitor's vessel at night, slipping unseen beneath an archway with a knife for cutting ropes, or laying a hidden line across the water to foul a rudder. Picture barrels of oil split open, a single spark igniting an inferno, and then the guilty party blending into the crowd of gondoliers as though nothing had happened. The violence of commerce was not in ledgers alone, it could erupt in flame upon the lagoon. Not all believed in sabotage, of course. Chroniclers, priests, and frightened sailors often reached for explanations more supernatural. A ship consumed in fire? Perhaps cursed by a witch slighted on shore. A vessel sunk without trace. Punishment from the saints for blasphemous words or ungodly deeds. One Venetian monk even wrote of a merchant ship bearing ambergris, a cargo of extraordinary value, exploding in the lagoon because the crew had mocked Saint Mark. You can almost hear the monk's sermon ringing out, "Mock not the holy, or your fortunes shall be drowned in smoke and salt." Such stories, woven into sermons and tavern gossip alike, gave a divine logic to the otherwise terrifying randomness of maritime disaster. Every sense is stirred as you wander. The air smells of brine and damp wood, but mingled within are the sharper scents of spice casks just unloaded, pepper biting the nose, cinnamon sweetening the air. Gulls circle overhead, shrieking, while sailors curse in Greek, Arabic, and Venetian dialect, their ropes straining under the weight of cargo. Sometimes, unexpectedly, a whiff of smoke drifts across the canals. Is it a baker's oven, a blacksmith's forge, or the early sign of another fire? For men working the docks, every wisp of smoke meant a racing heart, and then there are the stranger tales. Some lost ships were said to have carried bizarre cargo, caged animals with eyes gleaming in the dark, jars of powders labeled in languages no Venetian could read, or vials of alchemical experiments meant to transform lead to gold. One can picture such a ship rocking in the current, half its hold packed with shimmering silks, the other half with fragile glass flasks of unknown substances, destined either to bring fortune or to burst in a blaze of ruin. These mixtures of commerce and mystery became irresistible fuel for legend, stories retold over wine late into the night, stories that chilled the blood as much as they delighted the imagination. Technological hindsight provides explanations that strip away some of the glamour. Shipbuilding of the age, though skilled, often left vessels vulnerable to leaks. Overloaded cargo tilted ships dangerously, snapping masts or cracking hulls. Fireproofing was almost non-existent. Inspections, a concept for later centuries. In the fog and shadows of Venice's waterways, accidents blended easily with rumor, and rumor with superstition. In such a climate, the rise of the devil's ships as a persistent legend seems not only likely but inevitable. As you stroll along the Rialto at dusk, the marketplace is closing, and lanterns are being lit. Their reflections tremble across the water's dark surface like wavering omens. You think of sailors who risked not only storm and sea but sabotage and superstition, men who loaded casks of spice with trembling hands, fearing that a stray ember could erase fortunes in an instant. Venice, with all its splendor and intrigue, emerges before you not just as a city of art and wealth, but as a place where life was a precarious dance between human ambition, divine fear, and the perilous silence of the canals. And in the end, while the exact cause of this or that vanished vessel may never be known, the stories remain, whispered along alleys, across tavern tables, and down the centuries, carried like echoes over the dark waters of Venice. You trudge into the forests of northern Europe, where towering oaks and misty glades create an air of constant suspicion. Here lies the mystery of the medieval werewolves, not the Hollywood kind with glittery fur and full moon glamour, but humans accused of shape-shifting and hunting their neighbors under moonlight. Imagine stepping on a wet leaf, the fog curling around your ankles, as villagers mutter about a man who vanished and returned with eyes glowing like fire. Medieval Europe was paranoid, and werewolf trials were terrifyingly real. The mainstream fact is that between the 15th and 17th centuries, hundreds of people, mostly men, were accused of lycanthropy and brought before secular or ecclesiastical courts. Punishments ranged from fines to execution. Trials often included testimony about impossible feats, running on all fours, predation on livestock, or supernatural endurance. While the accused were unlikely to physically transform, the fear was genuine. You can almost feel the icy grip of that panic, a mass anxiety that made every shadow a threat, the quirky twist. Some historians argue these accusations were often linked to mental illness or ergot poisoning, the same fungus implicated in dancing plagues. Imagine someone hallucinating under the influence of contaminated rye, convinced they were a wolf, then being dragged before judges who believed them fully. Other cases were socially motivated. A wealthy neighbor or rival could accuse someone of lycanthropy to seize land or settle old grudges. In these instances, a man might face death because he had the misfortune to live next to a vindictive cousin. Historians still argue whether these trials were primarily superstition or early forms of social control. Some see them as a method for local authorities to enforce conformity or suppress heretical behavior. In smaller villages, labeling someone as a wolf, an outsider, a misfit, was an easy way to isolate troublemakers. Trials often involved bizarre tests, identifying marks, reciting prayers under duress, or submerging in water. You can picture a terrified villager wading into a stream, shivering, as the town watches, convinced that water can expose a werewolf. The sensory imagery is vivid. Mist curls around cottages, livestock huddle nervously in pens, and torches flicker against the damp forest floor. You hear the low growl of a dog, maybe imagined, maybe real, and the whisper of fear that runs like a current through the village. It's a world where rationality takes a back seat to rumor, superstition, and panic. Quirky details abound. One famous case in 16th century France involved a man named Gilles Garnier, executed for allegedly transforming into a wolf and devouring children. The trial record includes witnesses claiming to have seen him leap from one rooftop to another. Whether embellished or real, it's impossible not to shiver imagining a foggy night where ordinary people could become monsters in the collective imagination. Modern scholars interpret these episodes as both folklore and psychology. They show how societal pressures, disease, and fear can create legends that are terrifyingly believable. Ergot outbreaks, combined with famine and stress, likely amplified delusions and hallucinations. Yet, despite rational explanations, the stories endure because they capture human imagination at the intersection of fear and the unknown. You step through the mist, feeling the crunch of leaves underfoot, and think about the human need to explain the inexplicable. Werewolves, in this light, are less supernatural predators and more mirrors of medieval anxiety, fears projected onto the dark and unknowable woods. And yet, even centuries later, the idea of transformation, man to wolf, ordinary to monstrous, still whispers to us in folklore, literature, and that little chill you feel when the wind moves through the trees. You step into a quiet monastery in 12th century France, where the scent of candle wax and damp stone mingles in the air. Here lies the curious mystery of the miraculous ink. Monks spent years meticulously copying texts, and for centuries, some manuscripts displayed ink that resisted fading, smudging, or decay in ways that puzzled scribes and later historians alike. You imagine your fingers brushing a page, expecting dust or crumbling edges, only to find sharp, dark letters that seem almost alive, as if the words themselves wanted to endure. The mainstream fact is that medieval inks were primarily carbon-based, mixed with gum and water, or iron gall ink made from oak galls, iron salts, and vinegar. Properly prepared, these inks could last centuries, especially when applied to durable vellum. Yet some manuscripts seem unusually resistant to time, prompting modern scientists to examine their chemical composition. In some cases, traces of additives like wax or resin helped protect the writing, the quirky twist. A few medieval texts contain inks that were deliberately secret or experimental. One French codex contains an ink that glows faintly under ultraviolet light, discovered only in the 20th century. Scholars now believe some scribes added rare mineral powders or even plant extracts for durability, or perhaps just to make their work mysterious. Historians still argue whether these innovations were intentional for preservation or simply accidents of recipe and climate. Picture the sensory detail: the monk dips a quill into a dark, viscous liquid, the tip gliding across parchment with a satisfying scratch, the room smelling faintly of ink, beeswax, and wet stone. Outside, wind rustles through cloistered gardens, carrying a hint of cold air that makes hands stiff. You can almost feel the care, patience, and reverence required to craft letters meant to outlast generations. Another quirky tidbit: some inks were designed to be coded visually, with slight variations in shade indicating secret meanings. One manuscript seems ordinary at first glance, but scholars suspect marginal color shifts were instructions or mnemonic devices for religious rituals. You might think of it as medieval color coding, a divine cheat sheet hidden in plain sight, even the process of correcting errors added to the mystery. Monks sometimes scraped the vellum, applied special powders, and rewrote passages, leaving faint ghost-like traces of previous words. When viewed under modern imaging, these palimpsests reveal layers of thought, correction, and human effort invisible to the naked eye. It's like peeking into the monk's mind across 800 years, seeing doubts, revisions, and the occasional flourish of pride. Historians still debate the extent of scientific knowledge applied to inkmaking. Did some monks understand the chemical longevity of their materials intuitively, or were they relying on handed-down recipes with a few lucky successes? Perhaps a bit of both. Either way, the results are impressive. Imagine tracing a finger along the page of a manuscript that has survived fires, floods, and centuries of handling, the words as crisp as when first penned. It's a quiet miracle of medieval ingenuity, a reminder that even in an age without modern chemistry, humans experimented, observed, and achieved durability in ways that still puzzle us. These manuscripts whisper across time, proof that medieval scribes were part alchemist, part artist, and part secret keeper, leaving clues in ink that refuse to vanish. You walk now through a medieval town just after dusk, the smell of smoke and bread mixing in the narrow streets, and you notice something odd: tiny, strange footprints carved into stone thresholds, arranged in curious patterns. These are apotropaic marks, medieval symbols meant to ward off evil, witches, or demons, often scratched near doors, windows, and chimneys. Imagine kneeling to trace a series of intersecting lines and circles, feeling the intention behind each mark, a silent plea for safety against unseen forces. The mainstream fact is that these marks, sometimes called witch marks or ritual protection marks, were widespread across Britain and parts of Northern Europe. Archaeologists have found them in churches, farmhouses, and castles, often at entry points where supernatural threats were believed most likely to intrude. They were thought to trap or confuse malevolent spirits, much like a charm or amulet, and they show the everyday spiritual concerns of ordinary people. Here's the quirky twist: some marks were surprisingly intricate. In Kent, for example, researchers found marks shaped like wheels with intersecting lines, perhaps intended to trap witches in their own paths. In other cases, masons' marks, once thought purely functional, appear alongside protective symbols, suggesting a blend of craft and magic. You can almost imagine a stonemason pausing in his work to scrawl an extra rune, muttering a quick prayer against misfortune. Historians still argue whether these marks were purely folk superstition or had elements of Christian ritual embedded. Some symbols echo the sign of the cross, while others resemble geometric traps or pagan motifs. They were a sort of medieval hybrid, part practical, part spiritual, part psychological reassurance for people living in uncertain and often dangerous times. Picture the sensory detail, running your hand over cold, rough stone, noticing grooves and scratches worn smooth by centuries of touch. Outside, a gust rattles shutters, and you hear the faint creak of a gate. Each mark feels alive, a whisper of a person long gone who feared what you cannot see. It's eerie but oddly comforting, a tangible connection to medieval life and its anxieties. Quirky tidbits abound. In some homes, marks appear near the hearth, perhaps to guard against fire or malevolent domestic spirits. In churches, symbols were often hidden behind altar rails or in roof beams, invisible to most worshippers. The marks show that magic, superstition, and faith existed side by side, and were interwoven into the very architecture of daily life. Modern technology has revealed even more. Specialists using raking light and 3D scanning can detect marks invisible to the naked eye, uncovering layers of protection applied over centuries. Some buildings display dozens of overlapping marks, suggesting repeated fear or repeated inhabitants' efforts to maintain safety. It's as if the stones themselves absorbed centuries of human vigilance. You step back and take it in, walls, doors, thresholds, all covered in silent warnings. It's a world where danger wasn't just external but imagined, where superstition was a lifeline. The marks remind us that even in a seemingly rational medieval society, the unseen and unknowable carried weight, and humans responded with creativity, ritual, and small acts of hope etched into stone. You wander now into the shadows of a medieval battlefield, the morning mist clinging to armor and the smell of wet earth heavy in your nostrils. It's the 100 Years' War, and you're standing on a field littered with banners, weapons, and memories of chaos. Among the familiar stories of knights and kings lies a quieter, long unsolved mystery: the missing bodies from battles. Entire units vanished, leaving mass graves undiscovered for centuries. You tread carefully, imagining the echo of swords clashing and orders shouted over the din, knowing that some questions may never be fully answered. The mainstream fact is that battles like Agincourt in 1415 and Crécy in 1346 were devastating. Thousands died in a single day, but medieval logistics were poor at recovering the dead. Bodies were often left on the field or buried hastily in mass graves. Over time, erosion, construction, and natural decay erased many traces, making it difficult for historians to locate exact battle sites or confirm casualties. Archaeology, however, has been helping fill these gaps. Excavations have uncovered skeletons showing trauma consistent with medieval weapons, giving insight into the human cost of warfare. The quirky twist. Some modern discoveries have involved bizarre findings. At certain excavation sites, archaeologists have unearthed skeletons with strange, ritualistic arrangements. Arms extended, head tilted, or tools carefully placed, suggesting funerary practices or perhaps battlefield superstition. Were these carelessly buried victims, or did someone attempt to appease spirits in the chaos of war? Historians still argue whether such arrangements were deliberate ritual or accidental, perhaps reflecting hurried burials or the uneven terrain of the battlefield. Imagine the sensory scene: mud sucking at your boots, the metallic tang of iron lingering in the air, and a wind that carries whispers of both triumph and terror. You crouch by a trench and notice fragments of armor, broken arrowheads, and the faint impressions of once trodden paths. It's haunting to realize that beneath your feet lies centuries of unanswered questions and countless untold stories. Quirky detail: in one dig near Agincourt, a skeleton was found with a small, carefully placed coin in its mouth, a possible medieval superstition to pay for the soul's passage or merely a hurried token from comrades. These small objects offer rare glimpses into the humanity of soldiers long dead. Their fears, hopes, and superstitions preserved in the dirt. Even scientific advances haven't solved all mysteries. DNA analysis, isotope studies, and careful stratigraphy allow researchers to determine origins, diet, and trauma of the fallen. But who ordered the burials? Which units are these soldiers from? Some questions remain forever speculative, a reminder that medieval warfare was chaotic, unrecorded in many ways, and brutally efficient at erasing lives. You take a deep breath, feeling the cold morning mist settle on your face, and reflect on how much of history is invisible: bodies buried beneath fields, graffiti hiding in cathedrals, children lost in woolpit. Yet, the combined efforts of archaeologists, historians, and forensic science gradually piece together the puzzle, offering glimpses of lives once obscured by time. The battlefield isn't just a place of death, it's a canvas of mystery, survival, superstition, and resilience, preserved for those patient enough to look closely. As you step away, the mist lifts slightly, revealing the sun glinting on armor fragments and banners still fluttering in imagination. History's mysteries have been solved in part, teased out by science and scholarship, yet many shadows remain, urging you to keep asking questions, keep imagining, and keep walking among the echoes of the past. Now, as you settle into the softness of your bed, feel the weight of the day lift. The streets, forests, and battlefields you wandered through slowly blur, their sounds muted, the sharp smells of ink, smoke, and frost dissolving into gentle calm. The medieval world, with all its oddities, fears, and ingenuity, recedes like a tide, leaving only faint impressions in your mind. You might remember dancing plagues, green-skinned children, vanished princes, or strange manuscripts. But let them float as harmless shadows rather than urgent problems. Breathe deeply, letting your lungs fill with quiet, imagining the soft rustle of parchment or the hush of a cloistered garden rather than the clamor of marketplaces or the roar of armies. Even the eerie markings on thresholds, the scratches of graffiti, and the cold of the Little Ice Age become part of a rhythm, history's slow, deliberate heartbeat. Your own pulse slows in response. Picture the flickering candlelight, the whisper of wind through leaves, the gentle lapping of a Venetian canal. All the mysteries you've walked among exist in the past, preserved and partly solved, but now they exist only in your imagination. You are safe, tucked away in comfort, with the knowledge that human ingenuity, fear, and curiosity have shaped every stone, scroll, and skeleton you've encountered. Let your eyelids grow heavy. The medieval world folds softly around you, no longer urgent, no longer dangerous, only a faint echo, a story to drift with into sleep. Every puzzle solved or partially solved reminds you that curiosity can be gentle, patient, and soothing. The night wraps around you as history itself whispers, and in that quiet, you find rest.